A third major problem with taking the 600,000 figure literally, yielding a total population of 2 to 3 million, is identified in the Faith Life Study Bible, which says these figures are difficult to reconcile with the archaeological record. This is putting it mildly. As scholar Lester Grabe states, no event the size and extent of the Exodus could have failed to leave significant archaeological remains. According to the book of Numbers, much of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness was spent near Kadesh Barnea. This and related sites in Sinai and southern Palestine should yield ample evidence of a large population in this region. He notes, however, that the area has been extensively excavated, and yet we find nothing. The IVP Bible Background Commentary concurs. If a couple of million people lived in the desert for 40 years, and half of them died there, archaeologists expect we would find at least some traces of them, especially in places like Kadesh Barnea, where they stayed for some time. A fourth major problem with taking the 600,000 figure literally in this passage would be the simple matter of logistics and the trek they would have taken. Again, this is from the IVP Bible Background Commentary. As it traveled, the line of people would stretch for over 200 miles. Even without animals, children, and the elderly, travelers would not expect to make 20 miles a day. When families and animals move camp, the average would be only 6 miles per day. Whatever the case, the back of the line would be at least a couple of weeks behind the front of the line. This would create serious difficulties in the crossing of the Red Sea, which is said to have been accomplished overnight. So basically what it's saying, the front of the line would have reached Sinai long before the back of the line, even finished crossing the Red Sea. Fifth, the problem goes much deeper than the lack of archaeological evidence or the impossibility of 3 million people making this trek so quickly. According to Numbers 33:49, they camped by the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth as far as Abel Shittim in the plains of Moab. A note in the Faith Life Study Bible says that Beth Jeshimoth and Abel Shittim were approximately 7 miles from each other. So that would make the total area of the Israelite encampment about 49 square miles. Now, did you catch that? 49 square miles. You have to fit 2 to 3 million people, plus all their animals, in 49 square miles in a livable way. The Faith Life Study Bible continues. By comparison, New York City, with a population of 8.1 million in 2010, covers 305 square miles. Taking the number 2 to 3 million at face value, therefore, requires that the Israelite camp had, now get this, a greater population density than New York City without any multi-living accommodations. In other words, they're not building skyscrapers. They're not in high-rise apartments. They're not even building 2-story houses. They're in tents. They're on the ground. All of them. 2 to 3 million people plus all their livestock. New York City has a population density of 27,000 people per square mile. If you do the math, the Israelite encampment in Numbers 33 would yield a population density of about 61,000 people per square mile. The only thing that makes the population density of places like New York City, Paris, and Hong Kong even possible today is our modern way of living and the structures that we build. This was not in the picture back then. Finally, add to all of this the fact that Deuteronomy 7:7 informs us that Israel was the least numerous nation in Canaan at the time of the conquest. It lists 7 other nations that were larger. Michael Heiser illustrates the problem. Heiser says, this means that if the figures in Exodus are to be taken literally, the total population of these 8 nations collectively would have to range from 16 to 24 million people, roughly the 2010 population of Florida or Texas, respectively. The size of Canaan, however, is closer to that of New Jersey than either of these 2 states. Heiser continues, so take the whole population of Texas and stick it in New Jersey and assume every square foot of it is livable, and you can see the problem. New Jersey's about 35 times smaller than Texas. There just isn't enough room, and you need water. So you can't just have every square foot of it occupied. You have cattle. Where are they going to go? Are you riding them the whole time? And can you imagine the human and animal waste? This is before sewage systems. It's ridiculous to imagine at these numbers, continues Heiser. There literally isn't the square footage, the square mileage in this place we call Canaan to have 8 nations, the smallest of which is roughly 3 million people. So, what does all of that mean? What it means is that that original number in Exodus 12:37, 600,000 fighting men on foot, cannot possibly be literal. Whatever the real number was, it was much, much smaller. In fact, in Genesis 15:16, Abraham's told that his descendants would return to the land of Canaan in 4 generations. John Wenman did the math here. If the birth rate quadruples the population every generation, we should get somewhere between 17 and 18,000 in 4 generations. And it goes without saying, this is a far cry from 3 million. It seems clear then that the biblical writer in Exodus 12:37 is using hyperbole. And this isn't the only time it's going to happen in the pages of the Old Testament. In fact, this is just the beginning. Examples abound. Take, for instance, the number of enemies slain in many passages. Judges 12:6 is a good case in point. According to the passage, 42,000 Ephraimites are slain at the river Jordan for mispronouncing Shibboleth. I'm not entirely sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, so I'm glad I wasn't living back then. Anyway, scholars point out the problem here. The census total for the tribe of Ephraim back in Numbers 26 is only 32,500. Heiser puts it this way: you can't really kill more people than actually exist. David Fouts notes that even if we allow for an increase in the Ephraimite warrior population, between the book of Numbers and Judges, this still does not alleviate the problem of the enormity of the number of those slain. To put what Fouts is saying into perspective, 42,000 slain is almost 10,000 more than the total amount of U.S. combat deaths during the entire Korean War, and only about 5,000 less than Vietnam. With this in mind, consider the words of 2 Chronicles 28:6, where Pekah, the son of Remaliah, kills 120,000 in Judah in one day. To get some perspective on this, think about the fact that it took an atomic bomb to kill 80,000 people in one day in Nagasaki. As Raymond Dillard says in his commentary on 2 Chronicles, the numbers of the dead are higher than is historically probable, and get this, would amount to the complete depopulation of the tribe of Judah. Thus, Dillard says, it appears the chronicler intends to be using these large numbers as hyperbole. Again, your better commentaries, they're just honest with the data. Another example, 2 Kings 20:29, we're told that 1 Kings, thank you. Yeah, 1 Kings 20:29, although it might have been a typo in here, so it might be 2 Kings, I don't know. We are told that 7,000 sons of Israel killed 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers in one day. Now, if these numbers are literal, the Israelites were pretty tough indeed. And you have to wonder, if 100,000 foot soldiers are no problem for 7,000 fighting Israelites, how on earth could Pharaoh's small army of 20,000 have posed any sort of a threat for the 600,000 fighting Hebrews when they were leaving Egypt back in Exodus? In the ratio in Kings, you have every one Israelite taking down 14 Arameans, but back in Exodus, 30 Israelites couldn't handle one Egyptian? Really? The real problem, however, comes in the next verse. It says an additional 27,000 Arameans were killed when they fled to the city of Aphek, and, quote, a wall fell on them. Now, that had to be a really long wall to kill this many people. Those who've done the math point out that we're looking at a structure comparable to the Great Wall of China. Again, we're obviously looking at an embellished, exaggerated, and hyperbolic number. There's simply no archaeological evidence of a wall this large at any time in this area, much less an entire city for a wall like that to surround. You know, as I was doing the research for this 2 years ago, it just, I started thinking it's really easy to gloss over these large numbers and pay lip service to interpreting them literally no matter what. Our problem today is all too often we read the numbers, but we don't take the time to run the numbers. When you do, it literally becomes impossible to take these impossible numbers literally. And perhaps nowhere is this more evident than Solomon's great sacrifice on the day of the dedication of the house of the Lord. According to 1 Kings 8 and the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 7, Solomon sacrificed 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. And 1 Kings, to me, clearly indicates that this all took place in a single day. So that's a total of 142,000 animals sacrificed in one day. Ed Walsh has a post on the puritanboard.com called "Some Facts in the Bible Bother Me." Walsh is a civil construction estimator by trade, so, working with numbers and total area, that's what he does for a living. And Walsh puts this into perspective for us. He says the area of Solomon's temple was about a third of an acre, and an acre of land will fill 2/3 of a modern football field. So this is basically what we're looking at if we compare Solomon's temple to a modern football field. Having said that, it would take over 100 football fields to contain the 142,000 animals waiting to be sacrificed on that day. The sheer amount of animal flesh after the sacrifices is just staggering to even think about. Walsh writes, assuming an average weight for oxen at 1,000 pounds and 200 pounds for sheep, that's 46 million pounds of sacrificed animal flesh. The total blood volume, according to Walsh, would be over 400,000 gallons, which is enough to fill 362 26-foot above-ground pools. Aside from this, think about the time factor involved here. In a 24-hour period, almost 2 animals would be sacrificed per second. Some scholars, seeing the problem here, they try and stretch the whole thing out over an extended period of time. And it's really funny because that extended period of time differs from scholar to scholar, but the longest they've come up with, as far as you can go with it, would still require 20 sacrifices a minute for 10 days, for 10 hours a day, for 12 days. So that's as far as you can stretch it, and you still don't even come close to alleviating the problem. Dillard, in his commentary, he interacts with some of this, and he simply concludes by saying, look, the chronicler probably intends these figures as hyperbole. And he simply moves on to the next verse. Dillard does this because it's patently obvious that if we insist on taking these large numbers literally, we have a real problem. And no amount of extended time or complex calculations really resolves the problem. Further exasperating this problem is the way in which the chronicler handles many of these large numbers in comparison with the parallel accounts elsewhere in the Bible. All too often, the chronicler's numbers do not match what other biblical writers record. In fact, he inflates them even further. For example, in 2 Samuel 8, David captures 1,700 horsemen. But in 1 Chronicles 18, it's 7,000 horsemen. In 2 Samuel 10, David kills 700 charioteers, but in 1 Chronicles 19, the number is again 7,000. In 1 Kings 7, Solomon's house can hold 2,000 baths, but in 2 Chronicles, it's 3,000 baths. In 2 Samuel 24, Joab's census has the number of valiant men in Israel at 800,000. But the chronicler puts the number at 1,100,000. What these last examples show is that the literal approach to these large numbers is not an option because it would make the Bible contradict itself in places. So, at this point, we have to ask ourselves, what are the biblical writers doing? Exactly what is going on in these passages? Are they being intentionally deceptive? Well, if that were the case, they wouldn't be very good deceivers, would they? The very people they're writing to are the same people they're writing about. Thus, John Wenham asked this question: who would make up figures which are so patently absurd? And he makes this modern comparison, and it's really good. Would any man in his senses today invent a story of a bus crash in which 16,000 passengers were killed? Just like we all know today that 16,000 people aren't going to die in a bus crash, or you can't fit the entire population of Texas into New Jersey in any sort of realistic or livable way, they surely would have known you can't fit 24 million people into the land of Canaan, or 3 million people into an area of only 49 square miles. They would have surely known you can't kill more people than actually exist, that there was no wall big enough to fall on 27,000 men, and it's unlikely that someone could sacrifice 142,000 animals in one day. The ancient people weren't ignorant. They weren't stupid. They could comprehend both numbers and geography. They knew where they lived and how big it was. They were aware of their surroundings. So, deliberate deception can't possibly be the aim here, because no one in the ancient world would have bought it. Something else must be going on. And indeed, there is. David Fouts has done much research in this area. Oh, that was the John Wenham quote. Okay, sorry about that. That's David Fouts. David Fouts has done much research in this area. And as it turns out, embellishing or exaggerating numbers in this manner was actually a very common device in the ancient world. Mathematical accuracy wasn't the aim at all, and literate readers were actually expecting numeric hyperbole. Fouts cites numerous examples where large numbers are employed in a hyperbolic fashion in the epic literature of the ancient world. For example, an Assyrian war text dating around 1300 BC speaks of one of their warriors with only an army of 90 chariots plundering 254,000 men. In an Assyrian banquet inscription, the king boasts of bringing over 69,000 people into his palace at once and feeding and clothing them for 10 days. There's an example of an Elamite warrior who conquers 70 cities in one day. Historians recognize this as a clear example of ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. Fouts also gives examples of the same sort of thing we just saw going on in Chronicles, where, one writer gives one total and another writer gives a different total for the same account. He has one where it's 14,000 warriors in one account and over 20,000 in the other. Fouts cites a particular Ugaritic text, the legend of King Kurtu, who is said to have had the mightiest army, numbering over 3 million. To put this into perspective, in our modern world, China has the largest number of active military personnel, and it's just barely over 2 million. Ugarit was a Canaanite city. And remember, Canaan is comparable in size to New Jersey. So that's a far cry from the size of China. As Fouts notes, the language of this Ugaritic epic, an army numbering 3 million, is clearly meant to be understood as hyperbole. Probably the most relevant example of numeric hyperbole for our purposes here would be the Sumerian kings list, where various kings are said to have lived impossibly long lives and had impossibly long reigns, to the tune of 28,000 years, 36,000 years, 43,000 years, and so on and so forth. These are just a few examples. Fouts has a number of these, and he makes this observation. It is evident from a study of the literature available from the ancient Near East that in royal inscriptional genres, purposeful embellishment of numbers was the norm rather than the exception. And the point of this purposeful embellishment of numbers, the use of these obviously hyperbolic numbers was to magnify the greatness of the reigning monarch or deity of any given culture. In other words, to exalt the king or god of the people or nation of whom the literature was being written about and for. Fouts concludes that Scripture is no different than other ancient literature in that it uses large numbers hyperbolically, and that the ostensible purpose of this usage is to demonstrate the relative magnitude of a given leader or king. The large numbers are simply figures of speech employed to magnify King Yahweh, King David, or others in a theologically driven historical narrative. The hyperbolic use of numbers in the Old Testament, says Fouts, anchors the biblical text to the writing conventions of the time. Fouts' research demonstrates that the biblical writers are using a well-known literary device of the ancient world to draw attention to the might of Yahweh, King of all kings, earthly or divine. Earl Davies concurs. He writes, in attributing such large numbers to the Israelites, the biblical writer is merely observing a well-recognized literary convention, which is widely attested to in the literature of the ancient Near East. There seems to be little doubt that the biblical writers were simply following this same literary convention. The use of such grossly inflated numbers in the Old Testament, continues Davies, was to serve a specific theological purpose. That purpose being to signify the miraculous power of Yahweh, just as other cultures used the exact same literary device to signify the greatness of their king or god, or whichever servant of that god the text might be speaking. This is what literate readers of the time were expecting. Consequently, Brian Godawa writes, it is no heresy or leap of logic to conclude that the Hebrew scribes would write in a similar genre as those around them when they wanted to glorify their king and their God in comparison. In other words, if they wanted to glorify Yahweh and magnify the accomplishments of his people, of course they're going to do it in a way that comports with the literary conventions of their own time. Thus, in 1 Samuel 18:7, after David himself had personally killed just one man, a giant named Goliath, the women of Israel sang what? They sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So, maybe we've been familiar with this ancient literary device all along. We've just never stopped to think about it. This being said, I take great exception to the charge that we are somehow reducing or diminishing the millennium by taking a hyperbolic approach to the 1,000-year symbol in the book of Revelation. No one would say we're diminishing the magnitude of David's victory over Goliath by conceding the obvious fact that the women are using hyperbole in their song, yet we're somehow diminishing the magnitude of the millennium by suggesting that John just might be using hyperbole here? If hyperbole is the way the biblical writers do it, is it really so absurd to suggest the possibility that John's doing the same thing? And he's doing it in order to magnify the accomplishment of Christ and his people in a single generation, especially when the time texts seem to demand this. More to the point, I think it's the other approaches that reduce or diminish the millennium by not recognizing the use of hyperbole. According to amillennialism and modern postmillennialism, it's already taken God 2,000 years, and he still hasn't accomplished what was signified in a 1,000-year symbol? Max King put it this way: there's nothing too impressive about that kind of performance. To need 2,000 literal years in order to accomplish a 1,000-year symbol or a 1,000-year reign is the picture of incompetency, to say the least. I think King makes a great point here. Yahweh is not incompetent. Yeshua is not inept. If the a-mill or post-mill view is correct, it's already taken twice as long, 2,000 years, to accomplish what is signified in a 1,000-year symbol. If mankind perseveres for another 1,000 years, the symbol will equal 1/3 the actual time being symbolized. If 4,000 years, then 1/4 the time, and so on and so forth. The significance of the symbol diminishes incrementally as time goes on. Think of it this way: if your boss gives you 8 hours of work to do, and you get it done in less time, that's impressive. If it takes you twice as long, or 3 or 4 times as long, you're going to be looking for another job. With this in mind, Yeshua gave his disciples a job to do. After his resurrection, he commissioned 11 men, saying, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." By the time Paul penned his letter to the Colossians, he could say with confidence, this hope of the gospel has been, past tense, proclaimed in all creation under heaven. The purpose of the 1,000 years was to bind Satan from deceiving the nations. Yeshua bound the strong man and sent his apostles out to reclaim those nations. In other words, to bring people from all ethnic groups back into the fold. To let the Gentiles know that they too are welcome in Yahweh's family. This was their mission, this was their job, and they crushed it. The magnitude and magnificence of the millennium is not that it's going to take 2,000, 3,000, or even 10,000 years or more to accomplish what was signified in a 1,000-year symbol. That's turning the significance of the symbol on its head. Who speaks or thinks this way even today? If I say, Bill has the strength of 10 men, Bill's a pretty tough guy, right? If I say those 10 men have the strength of one man, those are 10 pretty weak guys. 10, the larger number, is hyperbolic for 1, the smaller number. This is how hyperbole works, not the other way around. If you want to express the fullness, the grandeur, the greatness of something in a non-literal way, you overstate it. You don't understate it. The magnitude of the millennium is that it took Yeshua's first century followers less than 40 years to accomplish what, by rights, should have taken 1,000 years. So, this approach does not reduce Christ's millennial reign to 40 years. It recognizes the enormity of the task that was accomplished in such a small fraction of time, beginning with a small handful of men. It recognizes the status and importance of the first century believers as they reigned at Christ's side while he was abolishing his enemies and placing them under his feet. It recognizes the strong biblical tradition of hyperbole as a means to magnify and glorify the Lord as he works in and through his people in order to accomplish his purposes. And finally, this approach recognizes the time constraints that the book of Revelation itself places on the prophesied events that it contains. They were close, near, and at hand in the first century. They were about to happen shortly and quickly. They were about to occur. Against this backdrop, Yeshua's first century followers completed their mission in record time. 1,000-year accomplishment in 40 short years. And that, I would propose, is what the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 signifies. I would suggest that John is simply repurposing a well-known and ancient rhetorical device. He's using hyperbole to magnify the greatness of Yeshua and the accomplishment of his first century followers, the accomplishment in a single generation. So hopefully this has some practical value in terms of apologetics. You know, critics often use the large numbers in the Old Testament as a stumbling block for accepting the Bible as historically accurate. If the large numbers, they actually anchor the biblical text to the writing conventions of the time. And, you know, as such, it actually validates its authenticity. So it does the opposite. And with respect to the New Testament and the book of Revelation, the time texts demand a first century fulfillment. This is something else critics recognize. If John is in fact using hyperbole with regard to the 1,000 years, then the 1,000 years really poses no problem in this regard with, you know, a first century fulfillment.